On August 8, 1963, 15 men stopped a Royal Mail train in the English countryside and walked away with £2.6 million in cash. That's somewhere between $70 and $90 million in today's money. 2.5 tons of banknotes loaded into a truck in under 20 minutes. And here's the kicker. They pulled it off using nothing more sophisticated than a leather glove and a 6-volt battery. No guns, no explosives, just a brilliantly simple trick with a railway signal light. But if you think this is a story about the perfect crime, think again. This is a story about how almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong, how the biggest cash robbery in British history left almost everyone involved broke, dead, or behind bars, and how a game of Monopoly with real money became the evidence that brought them all down. Let's talk about how it all happened. Britain in 1963 was a country in transition. The austerity of the post-war years was fading, but hadn't quite disappeared. The swinging 60s were just beginning to swing. The Beatles had just released Please Please Me. Young people were starting to question authority in ways their parents never had. And crime? Crime was changing too. The old-fashioned bank robbers were being replaced by a new breed, organized, methodical, and increasingly audacious. These weren't desperate men with shotguns. These were professionals who planned their jobs like military operations and saw themselves as businessmen in an unconventional line of work. Into this world came Bruce Reynolds. Born in 1931, Reynolds was the kind of criminal who read books and quoted poetry. He'd wanted to be a foreign correspondent, but ended up as a clerk at the Daily Mail. Too much ambition, not enough patience for the conventional route. So he turned to crime, and he was good at it. Reynolds had style, charisma, and most importantly, he had connections. By the early 60s, he'd assembled a crew of some of South London's most accomplished thieves. There was Gordon Goody, who many believed was actually the mastermind. Charlie Wilson, known as the Silent Man for his discretion. Buster Edwards, a former sausage thief turned professional criminal. Roy James, a talented racing driver and silversmith who could handle any vehicle. And about a dozen others, each with their own specialty. But Reynolds and his crew had a problem. They were successful, sure, but they'd never done anything really big. They'd hit airports, robbed warehouses, stolen from country houses. Good money, but nothing spectacular. They wanted their white whale. They wanted a score so big it would set them up for life. And then, sometime in 1962, they got a phone call that would change everything. The call led to a meeting with a man they would know only as the Ulsterman. Nobody knew his real identity for decades. He was introduced through Brian Field, a solicitor's clerk who had represented some of the gang members and had a flexible relationship with legal ethics. The Ulsterman worked for the Royal Mail, and he had information. Very specific information about the traveling post office trains that ran every night from Glasgow to London. These TPOs, as they were called, were rolling sorting offices. Postal workers would sort mail while the train barreled through the night at 70 miles per hour, picking up and dropping off mail bags without even stopping. And once a week, one of these trains carried something extra special in its high-value packages carriage. Money. Lots of money, usually around £300,000. But the Ulsterman had noticed something interesting about the schedule. The train running on August 8, 1963, would be carrying the proceeds from a Scottish bank holiday weekend. He estimated between £2 and £3 million, all in used, mostly untraceable banknotes. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Royal Mail knew these trains were vulnerable. In 1960, the Post Office Investigation Branch had recommended fitting alarms to all TPO carriages carrying high-value packages. By 1963, they'd finally gotten around to it and had equipped 3 secure carriages with alarms, bars over the windows, and reinforced doors. But at the exact time of the robbery, all 3 of those carriages were out of service, being repaired. So they'd pulled out a reserve carriage, one without any of the security features. The Ulsterman knew this. He'd done his homework. Whether this was just lucky timing or whether he'd somehow influenced the maintenance schedule, we'll never know. What we do know is that Reynolds and his crew now had a target, a timetable, and a train that was essentially unprotected. But there was a problem. None of them had ever robbed a train before. So they brought in reinforcements, the South Coast Raiders, another gang that specialized in exactly this kind of work. Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch, Jim Hussey, and crucially, Roger Corddry, a specialist in tampering with railway signals. The combined gang now numbered 15, eventually 16, when Ronnie Biggs was brought in for one specific reason. He knew a train driver. Because here was the challenge. They could stop the train, sure, but then they needed to move it half a mile down the track to Bridego Bridge, where they'd have cover and easy access to their getaway vehicles. For that, they needed someone who could actually drive the thing. The plan was simple, almost elegant. Corddry would tamper with a signal at Sears Crossing, between Leighton Buzzard and Cheddington. He'd cover the green light with a glove and use a battery to power the red signal. When the train stopped, they'd cut the phone lines, overpower the crew, uncouple the first two carriages from the rest, and drive them to the bridge. There, they'd form a human chain and load the money into a waiting truck. They'd bought Leatherslade Farm, a rundown property 27 miles from the robbery site, as their hideout. They'd stocked it with food and supplies. They'd spend a few days there, let the heat die down, then disperse with their shares and disappear. What could possibly go wrong? Well, for starters, almost everything. It's 3:03 a.m. on August 8, 1963. The Up Special TPO is thundering through the Buckinghamshire countryside. Jack Mills, a 58-year-old driver from Crewe, has been at the controls for hours. His second man, 26-year-old David Whitby, is beside him. The train consists of 12 carriages and carries 72 post office workers. The second carriage behind the engine is the HVP coach, and tonight it's carrying something special. 128 mail sacks containing £2.6 million in cash, the biggest payday the Royal Mail has transported in years. Mills sees an amber signal. He slows down. Then the red light. He brings the train to a complete stop. This is unusual. There shouldn't be a signal stop here, not at this time of night. Whitby climbs down from the cab to call the signalman from the lineside telephone. He picks up the receiver. Dead. The cables have been cut. As he turns back to the train, someone grabs him from behind. Multiple someones. He's overpowered before he can shout a warning. In the cab, Mills is trying to figure out what's happening when gang members appear on both sides of the locomotive. One climbs up. Mills grapples with him. Then someone else hits him from behind with a kosh, a metal-weighted club. The blow is vicious, probably harder than it needed to be. Mills drops, semi-conscious, blood streaming from his head. This moment, this unnecessary violence, will haunt everyone involved. It will destroy Mills's health and turn public opinion venomous against the robbers. It will change how the courts view them, and it will ensure that whoever did it remains one of the gang's most closely guarded secrets. But right now, the gang has a more immediate problem. They need to move the train to the bridge. They've got a professional train driver waiting for this exact moment. Ronnie Biggs' man, a retired driver they've been paying and preparing for months. He's experienced, reliable, knows the older locomotives inside and out. There's just one small problem. He can't drive this one. The Up Special is being pulled by an English Electric Type 4 diesel-electric locomotive, a relatively modern machine. The replacement driver, who later accounts will call Stan Agate, or just Peter, has only ever driven older shunting locomotives. He looks at the controls and freezes. He tries. Nothing happens. He tries again. The locomotive doesn't budge. Minutes are ticking by. The gang is panicking. They've planned everything down to the last detail, and now they can't move the bloody train because their hired expert doesn't know how to work the ignition. So they drag the injured, bleeding Jack Mills forward and force him to drive. Mills, concussed and terrified, somehow manages to operate the controls. The train lurches forward. Half a mile up the track, someone has stretched a white sheet between two poles. That's the signal to stop. Mills brings the train to a halt at Bridego Bridge. The assault force is ready. Frank Dewhurst is in charge of the HVP carriage. He's got 3 postal workers with him and an assistant inspector. They hear a commotion, then the sound of breaking glass. Someone's smashing the window of the center door with an axe. Assistant Inspector Kett shouts, "It's a raid!" They try to resist. Dewhurst and Kett are beaten with koshes. The others are forced to the floor in a corner of the carriage. Mills and Whitby are brought in, handcuffed together, and made to lie down with the others. The gang works with military precision. They've formed a human chain from the carriage to the waiting Austin Lodestar truck below. 120 sacks of mail, 2.5 tons of money, passed hand to hand. They work for 15 to 20 minutes. They're supposed to take all 128 sacks, but Reynolds has set a 30-minute time limit for the entire operation. 8 sacks get left behind. Those 8 sacks probably contained around 130,000 pounds, but they don't have time. They load the last bag, climb into the truck, and vanish into the night. Before they leave, one of them tells the postal workers not to move for half an hour. It's meant to give them a head start, but it's actually another mistake. When the police hear this, they calculate that the gang must have gone to ground within a 30-mile radius. Why else would they set a specific time limit? It narrows the search area considerably. By 4:30 a.m., the gang arrives at Leatherslade Farm. They're exhilarated. They've done it. The crime of the century. They start counting the money, dividing it into shares. 17 full shares of approximately 150,000 pounds each, plus several smaller amounts for associates. Someone breaks out the Monopoly board. They start playing with real money. 1,000-pound piles for properties. The mood is celebratory. Wives and girlfriends arrive. There's a party. They're untouchable, except they're not, because they're also listening to a police-tuned radio, and what they hear turns their celebration into panic. The police have worked out the 30-mile radius. They're conducting a dragnet search, going farm to farm, house to house. The gang realizes they need to leave much sooner than planned. Their carefully arranged timetable is falling apart. The vehicles they drove to the farm have been seen by the train crew. They can't use them. Brian Field goes to collect his share and takes Roy James to London to find replacement vehicles. Reynolds and John Daly pick up cars. The plan is to leave on Friday instead of Sunday. But there's still the matter of cleaning up. They've spent hours wiping down surfaces, trying to remove fingerprints, but Field has arranged something extra. He's paying a man they call Mark 10,000 pounds to come back after they've left, give the place a final clean, and burn it to the ground. 10,000 pounds, a fortune at the time, for one simple job: make the farm disappear. A few days later, Charlie Wilson calls Brian Field to check if the farm has been dealt with. Field assures him it has, but Wilson doesn't believe him. He arranges a meeting with Edwards, Reynolds, Daly, and James. They confront Field. He's forced to admit the truth. The man they paid to burn the farm has run off with the money and done absolutely nothing. The farm is still standing, complete with all the evidence they left behind. Wilson wants to kill Field on the spot. The others hold him back. By the time they're ready to go back and deal with it themselves, it's too late. The police have found it. On August 13th, 5 days after the robbery, a police sergeant and constable check out Leatherslade Farm following a tip from a herdsman named John Maris. The place is deserted, but it's a treasure trove of evidence. Empty mail sacks scattered everywhere. Wrappers from the National Provincial Bank in the cellar. The truck, hastily painted yellow. The Land Rovers, half-finished meals on the table. And crucially, fingerprints. Lots of fingerprints. Despite all the cleaning, they've missed some. There are prints on a ketchup bottle, and there are prints all over the Monopoly set. Playing games with real money seemed like fun at the time. Now it's going to send them to prison for 30 years. The investigation is being led by Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler of the Flying Squad. Butler is a legend at Scotland Yard. They call him One-Day Tommy for how quickly he catches criminals. They call him the Gray Fox for his cunning. He's also obsessive to the point of being difficult. He works 18-hour days and expects his team to do the same. He's secretive, won't share information even with his own men, and he's made catching the train robbers his personal mission. Butler gets a break when an informant comes forward through a distinguished barrister. The informant provides names. A second informant, a woman, fills in the gaps. The fingerprints from the farm are being matched to known criminals. Within weeks, Butler has a list of suspects. Against strong protests from Butler, photos of the wanted men are published in newspapers. This causes most of the robbers to go to ground, but it also generates leads. The first to be caught is Roger Corddry. He's hiding in Bournemouth with William Bowl, a friend who's helping him lay low in exchange for money to pay old debts. They make a critical mistake. They rent a garage from Ethel Clark, the widow of a police officer, and they pay 3 months' rent in advance using 10-shilling notes from the robbery. Mrs. Clark gets suspicious and tips off the police. Corddry is arrested. Bowl, who had nothing to do with the robbery itself, gets arrested too and will later be convicted despite being innocent. He'll die in prison in 1970, a victim of a miscarriage of justice that the police will eventually acknowledge. The arrests continue. Roy James is found. Ronnie Biggs. Jimmy Hussey. John Daly. The police discover briefcases full of money hidden in Dorking Woods, along with a hotel receipt from a German ski resort. It leads them to Brian Field. They arrest him, then his boss John Weeder, then Lenny Field, who'd helped purchase the farm. One by one, the gang members are rounded up. Bruce Reynolds escapes to Mexico. Charlie Wilson, Buster Edwards, and a few others manage to stay free for a while, but most of them are in custody by the end of 1963. The trial begins on January 20th, 1964, at Aylesbury Assizes. Because of the number of lawyers and journalists, they have to convert the offices of Aylesbury Rural District Council into a courtroom. The defendants arrive each day from Aylesbury Prison in a compartmentalized van, past huge crowds of spectators. The trial lasts 51 days, 613 exhibits, 240 witnesses. Mr. Justice Edmund Davies presides. On February 11th, there's a sensation. John Daly is found to have no case to answer. His lawyer argues that the only evidence against him is his fingerprints on the Monopoly set, and that he'd played Monopoly with his brother-in-law Bruce Reynolds months before the robbery. The judge agrees. Daly walks free. It turns out that Tommy Butler's obsessive secrecy has backfired. If the investigating officers had known that Daly's prints were only on the Monopoly set and nowhere else on the farm, they could have asked more targeted questions and destroyed his alibi. Butler made a mistake, but nobody holds him accountable. On April 15th, the sentences come down. Justice Davies describes the robbery as a crime of sordid violence inspired by vast greed. 7 of the robbers get 30 years. 30 years for armed robbery, even though they didn't actually use firearms. 30 years, which is longer than many murderers were getting at the time. The sentences shock everyone. They're seen as excessive, vindictive even, and they have an unintended consequence. According to Bruce Reynolds, those harsh sentences changed the criminal landscape in Britain. Before, professional thieves like them avoided guns because carrying firearms meant serious time if you got caught. After the train robbery sentences, criminals figured they might as well carry guns since they were going to get 30 years anyway. The sentences meant to deter crime may have actually made crime more violent. But the drama isn't over. On August 12, 1964, Charlie Wilson escapes from Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. It takes less than 3 minutes. A 3-man team breaks into the prison, overpowers the guards, and extracts Wilson. It's unprecedented. The escape team is never caught. Their leader, nicknamed Frenchie, disappears from the London criminal scene entirely. Within 2 weeks, Wilson has had plastic surgery in Paris. By November 1965, he's in Mexico City visiting Bruce Reynolds and Buster Edwards. 11 months later, in July 1965, Ronnie Biggs escapes from Wandsworth Prison. A furniture van parks alongside the prison wall during outdoor exercise time. A ladder drops over the 30-foot wall. 4 prisoners escape, including Biggs. The escape was planned by recently released prisoner Paul Seaborn and funded by Biggs's wife Charmian. Biggs and another prisoner named Eric Flower are smuggled to Paris for plastic surgery. The other 2 escapees are recaptured within 3 months. But Biggs is about to become a legend. So let's talk about what happened to the money. £2.6 million stolen. Less than £400,000 recovered. Where did it all go? This is where the story gets really interesting, because despite pulling off the biggest robbery in British history, almost nobody actually got rich from it. Roger Corddry's share was recovered when he was arrested, £141,007. Brian Field had £100,900 found in those briefcases in Dorking Woods. Another £36,000 was recovered from Jimmy White's caravan. Roy James had £12,041 on him when captured. And here's an interesting one. £47,245 was found in a telephone box in South London. That was part of a deal Detective Inspector Frank Williams struck with Danny Pembroke, one of the robbers who was never officially identified. Williams agreed not to charge Pembroke or his friends with more serious crimes if he returned £50,000. The money showed up in the phone box. Williams never admitted to the deal publicly, but the math adds up. But that still leaves over £2 million unaccounted for. Where did it go? The answer is depressingly mundane. Friends and family stole it. Associates grabbed it. Predatory gangsters extorted it. Lawyers charged enormous fees. The gang members who went on the run spent it living abroad. It turns out that hiding from international law enforcement is expensive, especially if you want to maintain any kind of lifestyle. Reynolds, Wilson, and Edwards all burned through their shares within a few years. Reynolds fled to Mexico with his wife Angela and son Nick. They lived well for a while, but the money didn't last. When it ran out, they moved to Canada, then France, trying to find work under false identities. Eventually, Reynolds got desperate enough to return to England, believing his old criminal contacts could help him get back on his feet. Instead, he was arrested in Torquay in 1968. Tommy Butler finally had him. Reynolds was sentenced to 25 years. He served 10. Charlie Wilson set himself up outside Montreal under the name Ronald Alloway, borrowed from a shopkeeper in Fulham. He bought a house on Rigaud Mountain, joined an exclusive golf club, became part of the local community. His wife and 3 children joined him. For a while, it worked. Then he made a mistake. He invited his brother-in-law over from the UK for Christmas. Scotland Yard tracked the brother-in-law, found Wilson, and waited 3 months hoping Wilson would lead them to Reynolds. He didn't. Tommy Butler arrested Wilson on January 25, 1968. Wilson was sent back to serve the remainder of his sentence. He was released in the mid-70s, but returned to crime. On April 24, 1990, he was found shot dead at his villa in Marbella, Spain. The murder was thought to be related to drug dealing. So much for his share of £150,000. Buster Edwards fled to Mexico with his family to join Reynolds and Wilson, but they hated it there. Unlike the Reynolds family, they didn't plan to stay permanently. They returned to England voluntarily in 1966. Edwards was sentenced to 15 years. After his release, he ran a flower stall outside Waterloo Station. His story was turned into a 1988 film called Buster, starring Phil Collins. But Edwards never escaped the weight of what he'd done. In November 1994, he hanged himself in a garage. His family continued running the flower stall after his death. Ronnie Biggs went to Paris for plastic surgery, then to Adelaide, Australia, where he worked as a builder under a false identity. When he got a tip that Interpol was showing interest, he moved to Melbourne and worked as a set constructor for Channel 9. Then the police discovered his Melbourne address. He escaped to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And this is where Biggs' story becomes something else entirely. Brazil had no extradition treaty with Britain, and Biggs fathered a Brazilian son, which gave him legal immunity from deportation. He couldn't be touched, so he lived openly in Rio for decades. He became a celebrity. Tourists would visit him. He'd pose for photos. He gave interviews. His Brazilian son even became a member of a pop band. Biggs was taunting the British authorities, and there was nothing they could do about it. In May 2001, aged 71 and having suffered 3 strokes, Biggs voluntarily returned to England. His stated reason was simple. I want to walk into a Margate pub as an Englishman and buy a pint of bitter. He was arrested immediately upon landing and sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. Jack Slipper, the detective who'd been chasing him for decades, opposed his release. Justice Secretary Jack Straw denied him parole in 2009, calling him wholly unrepentant. But on August 6, 2009, 2 days before his 80th birthday, Biggs was released on compassionate grounds. He died on December 18, 2013, aged 84. But what about the ones who never got caught? Because this is where the story gets really interesting. The police knew almost immediately who most of the gang members were. Within 3 weeks of the robbery, Commander George Hatherill had a list of 14 names. It was eerily accurate. Almost everyone who was later convicted was on that list. But a few people slipped through. Danny Pembroke was ex-Army, a South London taxi driver and member of the South Coast Raiders. At Leatherslade Farm, he was paranoid about fingerprints. He wore gloves the entire time, even inside the house. When he needed the toilet, he went outside rather than use the one in the farmhouse. Not a single piece of evidence connected him to the robbery, even though the police were satisfied he was involved. After the robbery, Pembroke left for America for a couple of years, then returned to live quietly in Kent. He was set up for life. The man who left no fingerprints kept his freedom and his money. He died in 2015, aged 79, from a heart attack in his sleep. His son confirmed his father's involvement in a 2019 documentary. Then there's the man some accounts call Flossie, or Bill Jennings, identified by researchers as Harry Smith. He was on both Hatherill's list and Tommy Butler's list, but they never gathered enough evidence to arrest him. Unlike most of the others, Smith actually got to spend his money. He bought 28 houses, a hotel, and a drinking club in Portsmouth. He died in 2008, having lived a comfortable life funded entirely by the robbery. Frank Monroe, another who got away, allegedly worked as a film stuntman after the robbery before starting a paper and scrap metal recycling business. He gave Reynolds a job after Reynolds was released from prison, though he didn't want to attract too much attention by employing him for long. And then there's the replacement train driver, the man who couldn't actually drive the train. He was never caught, never even suspected of existing by the police. Because in the end, Jack Mills had driven the locomotive, the police assumed Mills was the only driver involved. The replacement driver never profited from the crime either. Ronnie Biggs never paid him his £20,000 drink. Writer Piers Paul Reed tracked him down years later, living about 20 miles south of London, somewhat senile and being cared for by his wife. The wife admitted she'd burned all his clothes from that night and had nervously waited for years for either the gang to murder him or the police to arrest him. Reed promised not to reveal their identities. The man who was supposed to be crucial to the whole plan turned out to be irrelevant, unpaid, and anonymous. But let's talk about the victims, because this isn't just a story about clever thieves and bungling investigators. There are real people who suffered. Jack Mills, the train driver, never recovered from the blow to his head. He had constant trauma headaches for the rest of his life. He returned to work doing light duties but retired in 1967. He died in 1970 from leukemia. The leukemia wasn't related to the robbery, but Mills never overcame the psychological trauma. In 2012, Jim Hussey made a deathbed confession that he was the one who hit Mills, though some suspected this was to protect the real assailant. A locomotive was named Driver Jack Mills in his honor, and a road and crew bears his name. David Whitby, the second man who was assaulted on the tracks, was traumatized by the experience and never fully recovered. He was able to resume his job, but died of a heart attack in 1972 at the age of 34. These men weren't wealthy bankers or faceless institutions. They were working-class railroadmen doing their jobs. The violence used against them turned public opinion decisively against the robbers and ensured that even decades later, there would be no romanticizing of what happened. William Gerald Bowl, Roger Corddry's friend, died in prison in 1970 from cancer. He was convicted as one of the robbers despite only helping Corddry hide afterward. He knew nothing about the robbery until after it happened. The police later acknowledged he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. Two surviving gang members, Ronnie Biggs and Gordon Goody, gave sworn affidavits asserting Bowl was innocent and had been stitched up by the police. But the affidavits came too late. Bowl was already dead. So what did the Great Train Robbery actually accomplish? It changed British criminal history, certainly. It led to massive improvements in security for mail trains and eventually to the end of the traveling post office system entirely. The last TPO service ran in 2004. The robbery also changed policing. Tommy Butler's obsessive pursuit of the robbers became legendary. He got permission to delay his mandatory retirement so he could keep hunting them. When asked after Reynolds' sentencing if it was over, Butler said it wasn't over until Biggs was caught. In 1969, Butler was finally forced to retire. He died in 1970, aged 57. The same day, Biggs' memoirs were published in the Sun newspaper. Even in death, Butler couldn't catch him. The robbery changed criminal behavior too. Those 30-year sentences convinced criminals that if they were going to do serious time regardless, they might as well carry guns. Armed robbery became more violent in Britain after 1963. The unintended consequences of harsh sentencing created exactly the kind of armed criminals the sentences were meant to deter. But perhaps most significantly, the Great Train Robbery changed how Britain saw itself. This was 1963. The old certainties were crumbling. Deference to authority was declining. Young people were questioning everything. And here was a gang of working-class criminals who'd outsmarted the establishment, stolen millions, and, for a brief, glorious moment, gotten away with it. The media initially portrayed them as modern Robin Hoods, daring rogues thumbing their noses at the system. That narrative didn't survive the revelations about Jack Mill's injuries or the harsh realities of the aftermath. But for a moment, the robbers captured something in the national imagination. A sense that the old rules no longer applied, that cleverness and audacity could trump authority and tradition. Of course, the reality was far less romantic. Most of the robbers never enjoyed their money. Those who stayed free lived in constant fear of arrest. Those who were caught spent years in prison watching their shares evaporate. Families were destroyed. Lives were ruined. 2 men died violently. Several killed themselves or died young from stress-related illnesses. And all of it, all of the planning, the risk, the violence, the years in prison, came down to a few fingerprints on a Monopoly board because they couldn't resist playing games with real money. Today, you can visit the Thames Valley Police Museum and see that Monopoly board, along with a genuine £5 note from the robbery. The bridge where it happened was briefly renamed Train Robbers Bridge before public outcry led Network Rail to change it back, settling eventually on Mentmore Bridge. The locomotive that pulled the train was scrapped in 1984 after being involved in several serious operating incidents, as if it carried a curse. One of the mail carriages is preserved at the Knee Valley Railway, being slowly restored. These are the physical remnants of the crime of the century. But the real legacy isn't in museums. It's in how the robbery demonstrated that even the best-planned crimes fall apart through human error, that violence has consequences that echo for decades, and that the romantic image of the gentleman thief is usually just that, an image. The Great Train Robbery was carried out by men who thought they were smarter than everyone else, who believed they could commit the perfect crime with a glove and a battery. And in the end, what brought them down wasn't sophisticated forensics or brilliant detective work. It was fingerprints on a board game and a man who took £10,000 to burn down a farm and decided to just keep the money instead. Sometimes, the difference between the crime of the century and a complete disaster is just whether someone remembers to wear gloves while playing Monopoly.